So let me get started. Again, thank you for joining us for Education Law Center's annual Education Justice Lecture. I'm Bob Kim, Executive Director of Education Law Center. I'm going to make a few remarks here just to start off. First of all, though this lecture is free to attend, this event is an important fundraiser for ELC. We would greatly appreciate if you would consider, those of you online, in making a contribution to support our work using the link provided in the chat. Also, for an update on ELC's work, our new strategic plan and what we're up to, I encourage you to visit our new website at edlawcenter.org. We'll also put that link in the chat. And I would like to extend our sincerest gratitude to NJEA, to AFT New Jersey, to ETS, to White and Case, and the New York Teachers Union, as well as Arnold and Porter, and many other organizations and firms that have contributed to this event. We will be distributing an electronic version of our event journal to all webinar participants and ELC supporters following the event. You can also access the journal using the link provided in the chat. And additional thanks, of course, to the ELC staff and trustees for their assistance organizing this lecture. Today's program, the Education Beat, Journalism, Education Equity, and How to Get the Education Message Across, will be divided into 3 parts: a keynote presentation, a response panel, and audience Q&A. Please note that the chat feature has been disabled, and we ask that you please write any questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be emailed to all webinar registrants. If you're posting about this event on social media, please tag ELC at edlawcenter, and use the hashtag Education Justice, and we'll also put this link in the chat. Today's keynote will be delivered by Valerie Strauss, a well-known longtime education writer who authored the Answer Sheet blog in the Washington Post. Valerie is currently also writing a book about education and journalism. Following Valerie's lecture, you'll hear from John Mooney, a longtime New Jersey education reporter for the Star-Ledger and the Bergen Record, and the founding editor of New Jersey Spotlight News. And Ashley Burns, a communications strategist with RALLY, an advocacy-oriented communications group. And Ashley focuses on racial and gender equity in education and other social issues. You can read the full bios of all our speakers in our event journal or take a look in the chat. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Valerie to begin our lecture. Valerie?
Hi, thank you so much for that. Thanks for inviting me here, and I'd like to thank you also for the important work the center has done year in and year out in support of public education and the right of all Americans to send their children to safe, high-quality, integrated public schools. That work has always mattered, though never so much as right now. In fact, today I believe it is existential. I've been thinking about the theme of this conference for some time now, and I always seem to come back to one word. That word is still. We are still forced to talk about how to achieve true education equity because we still don't have it. And I would argue we are further away from it than we once were. In many places in this country, we are retreating, and even the aspiration to provide equity in education seems to have disappeared. Horace Mann's mantra of public education being the great equalizer in American society is being lost in a wave of illiberal thinking and action by players intent on turning back the clock on the expansion of basic democratic principles. We have an ascendant movement working to privatize the nation's most important civic institution, and it is making important inroads. Nearly a dozen states today have universal vouchers, and billions of dollars are being funneled to bolster private and religious schools. Betsy DeVos and Ron DeSantis have literally advanced a new definition of public education to include private and religious education over which the public has no control, but is somehow required to fund. It's oxymoronic, but that's hardly the only thing that is these days. And of course, we still have Donald Trump, who could be president again, who has compared public education to carnage. That all means there is still a huge task ahead, finding ways to not only improve our schools to be exemplars we want them to be, but also to persuade the public on the value and importance of public education. Because frankly, whatever efforts that have been put forward, they're not working. It seems as if the people who are highly effective at getting out their message about public education are the people who don't believe in it. Sure, a lot of what they say isn't true, most of it. In an age where there seems to be no consensus on the truth, that seems to no longer matter to too many people. Part of this is because of a failure of advocates to effectively engage the public about the value of public education and to counter the many lies and myths being thrown into the public square by people with a lot of money to spread them. They call it education freedom. It's actually the opposite, but that's a powerful mantra. Another part of the problem, the mainstream media, of which I was a part for decades, has, in my view, failed overall to dig into the most important education stories and tell the public what is at stake, instead taking the word of people like Bill Gates and others about how schools should be reformed. This situation in the media is made worse by the fact that there are fewer and fewer news outlets to do the work. Hundreds and hundreds of local news outlets have closed in this century, and education reporting teams have been reduced at many news outlets that have survived. At the Washington Post, where I worked for more than 35 years until just a few months ago, the education team was unceremoniously cut in half this year, and the editors who made the decision decided to, quote unquote, refocus our coverage on what they called, quote, political education coverage, unquote. They couldn't explain what they actually meant, but that's what they said they wanted. As of last Sunday night, I will say, the editor who decided that is no longer there, so it remains to be seen what will happen. But I doubt getting education coverage right will be one of the first things the new editors take up. Readers have to push. Those are the realities we are facing, as you well know. We are living in times where still and again are operative words. The good thing about them is that they suggest we aren't at an end. The fight can continue. It is not inevitable that our public schools or our democracy will be lost or left to function at reduced capacity. But they can't be saved and improved with indifference and a national discussion laden with lies, misinformation, and myths. It is absolutely vital that the country realize that the assaults on publication are not separate from the assault on democracy. They are part of the same piece. We are not only still fighting for education equity, but we are also still fighting for other rights we thought we had won. The right to vote and have our vote count, abortion, access to birth control, the separation of church and state, honoring election results, opposing fascism and authoritarianism. These are the fights of our time, and they are all interrelated. Those seeking the privatization of public schools oppose other public institutions too. Any discussion about the future of public education must be rooted in that. Ultimately, our public schools can only be as good as the country allows them to be. I'd like to take a minute to go back to 1994. That's when I started covering education at the Washington Post. You probably won't be surprised to hear that most journalists don't go into the business with the idea of spending their careers covering education. It has long been considered a beginner's beat, one that some reporters go through to get somewhere else, to say politics or foreign affairs. This is the case, possibly, because just about everybody goes to school and they already think there is everything to know. They think they know it, they think everybody knows how schools operate. The author of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance hit it on the head when he wrote, "What makes our world so hard to see clearly is not its strangeness, but its usualness. Familiarity can blind you too." I confess I never saw myself as a longtime education reporter either, having spent the first part of my career in foreign and international news as a reporter and editor at UPI, Reuters, the LA Times, and the Post. I didn't see myself that way, that is, until I did. After working for years as the Asia editor on the foreign desk at the Post, I decided it was time to try something else, and I began covering local education as an experiment. I suppose I was predisposed to that sentiment. Education was the key to the realm in my family, the way to personal and economic fulfillment. It was part of the family DNA that my sisters and I would go to public schools and then college. And my father's last job was as a professor. My parents were the first in their families born in the United States and both attended Chicago's public schools. After a detour in Geneva, they moved to Miami, settling in a neighborhood with good public schools. My mother brooked no slacking when it came to school. The day I came home with a report card that had 10 A's and 1 B was not a good day for me. For some years, my father directed the Federal Office of Economic Opportunity in Miami, and he would come home and talk about the government's war on poverty. He always said there wasn't enough money in it. It wasn't comprehensive, and it wouldn't bring true equity without real change. One of the things he always talked about was how schools were funded, how teachers were trained and compensated, and the fact that the country did not seem to really truly value its public education system. Well, there was a change, but not the ones he wanted. President Nixon tried to kill the OEO in the early 70s. He couldn't, but Reagan did. A wave of social conservatives swept the country, combined with a rise in religious nationalism and the spread of neoliberalism. The neoliberal movement, which seeks to operate the economy and our public institutions with market-based policies, didn't start with Reagan when he became president in 1981 and said, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. But it took on a new life regarding public schools. Reagan's first education secretary was Will Bennett, who tried to push school vouchers, starting the campaign we see with increasing frequency today. I will note that the only reason Reagan picked Bennett was because his first choice, Mel Bradford, couldn't get the job because he had a strong pro-Confederate worldview, as in all men are not created equal. He was still a star in the Reagan orbit. And if you thought that kind of thinking was part of our past, just a few weeks ago, a Virginia school district decided to bring back the Confederate names of a few schools that had previously dropped them, a new indication of a departure from progress. Hostility to public education is hardly new, even if most Americans have long supported it. What is new is that a combination of these various forces have put into policy and lawmaking power positions people who want to destroy it. Yet after all these years, I still don't think Americans understand how all of these forces have worked together to undermine public institutions, especially the schools. The past is never dead, William Faulkner said. It's not even past. It took me a few years after starting the EdBeat to understand what was happening in the education world. A few activists began telling me about a movement afoot to kill public education, which was part of the issue of equity. And they said, an assault on the most important civic institution in the country. At first, I didn't believe them. A bit hysterical, I privately thought. Surely, I responded to them, everyone believes in public schools. They said to me, you are so naive. You don't get it. They don't believe in public education. They want private and religious schools to operate without government intervention. Of course, I learned they were right. That was in 1997 when I met Ted Forsman, who, with his friend John Walton, started the DC Scholarship Fund that later became the only federally funded voucher program in the country. I asked him why he thought it was important, and his answer startled me. He said public schools were a mess, would never work, irredeemable. I asked him how he thought private schools would educate all of the millions of children in the country to the same standards. He said they would, and they didn't have to be to the same standards. I was practically gasping for breath. I began looking at education in this country in a very different way as a reporter, unlike most of my colleagues. I couldn't write stories about, say, test scores without explaining how the tests were flawed and the results often misused. I couldn't write about proposals to apply business practices to the operations of public schools without pointing out that children aren't widgets and public schools aren't meant to be profitable. I couldn't write about school funding hikes or declines without pointing out the inequitable property-based funding system. I noted that school reformers never talked about the most fundamental problems, like the inequitable funding. I noted that they only paid lip service to the idea of compensating teachers like the professionals they are. By the time President George Bush convinced Senator Ted Kennedy to support No Child Left Behind, I already knew it would be a disaster because it was based on false premises and used faulty accountability measures. Very few, if any, of my colleagues wrote about these things. I know this following is going to sound a little crazy, but here it is. Some of my certainty about the failure of all of this kind of accountability work was rooted in something that happened to me when I was in second grade. It was in the 1960s, Everglades Elementary School in Miami. My teacher administered the very first standardized test we had ever seen. I was a good student, thought it would be fun to do multiple choice, and I thought I would ace it. Well, I got a perfect score. I got a perfect 0. The questions were multiple choice, and I got them all wrong. I had entered my name incorrectly too, because it required a middle name and I didn't have it. So I got nothing right. When the Everglades principal called my mother to tell her we had a problem, my mom insisted on looking at the questions and my answers. One of the questions she long remembered was, grass is A, green, B, brown, C, yellow. I marked all of them as correct and annotated the answers in the margins. Our lawn was all 3 of those colors, depending on the time of year and whether the grass had baked in the sun, the chinch bugs had eaten it, or the sprinklers were working. To my second grade eyes, asking me to choose one best answer was a flawed enterprise. I thought it was a trick question. I thought they all were. I answered them all that way. My teachers didn't know what to do with me. They gave me an unofficial diagnosis that may have been the first and last case of quote unquote overcomprehension, and gave me assignments they hoped would help me answer test scores without quote unquote overthinking them. As for the principal, she realized the test was poorly written and she junked it. Not something principals can do today, as we sadly know. Clearly, the tests were poorly written. I learned part of the reason why that I never got any good at multiple choice tests when I went on the education beat and met assessment experts, including Linda Darling-Hammond. They told me the quality of testing in the United States was lacking and hadn't improved all that much from when I took them. So over the years, I wrote repeatedly about state accountability systems that required the use of student test scores to evaluate teachers, even though the tests weren't designed to do that. To make matters worse, some teachers were evaluated on the scores of students and even subjects they didn't teach. If it sounds nutty, it's because it was. Still, for many years, I was almost alone in writing about these kinds of things. Those people who thought President Obama would change things were sorely disappointed. He actually made the test more consequential than George W. Bush had. Obama said he supported public school teachers and their right to collective bargaining. But when Wisconsin's public school teachers were fighting for their rights, Obama flew to Florida to meet and share a stage with Jeb Bush and declare the Florida former governor a, quote, champion of education, unquote. This is the Jeb Bush who'd like to say our governance model includes over 13,000 government-run monopolies run by unions, unquote. That's what he called public schools. Obama's education agenda showed as clearly as anything that some Democrats had gone down the same rabbit hole as the Republicans. I have taken it as a point of pride in my education coverage all these years that I have managed to annoy just about every single side in the education world at one time or another, as it should be. I was never partisan. I just did not accept conventional wisdom. I even refused to be a member of the Education Writers Association because it is funded by and accepts as members employees of foundations and other groups that are at the center of the reform wars. Right now, one of the members of that association's board of directors is a senior vice president of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. I just don't think partisans should be part of an Education Writers Association. I moved into blogging in 2009 when my editors asked me to start one. It was a time when journalism was moving toward different storytelling and blogs were the rage. First, I flinched. I even hated the word blog. I didn't like the way it sounded. But then I realized I could approach the subject in a different way. Not the Winston Churchill said, the Nazis said kind of journalism. I could be more assertive, and I was. The blog gained a very wide audience, and at times was the most read spot on the Washington Post website. Turned out people did and do want to read about education, and many of them still want the truth. So, how are we going to get the message out? Who and in what ways? To me, the answers are in every way, and everybody who's a public advocate has to be involved. Every district, every activist, every American who cares about education. At the top of this list is actually the kind of work that the Education Law Center does. The issues of inequity have to be forced into the courts. When Obama left office, one of the things he did was set up a project to tackle gerrymandering, political gerrymandering. And former Attorney General Eric Holder heads that now. They've had some successes going to court challenging state election maps. and they raise a lot of money to support their effort. It can't be true that all of the philanthropic people in this country oppose public schooling. There has to be money for this kind of work. Americans who think the far right has hijacked the conversation have to get involved in conversations and activities at the local, state, and federal levels. They have to get in the faces of their local media where it exists and keep doing it. Calling once or twice doesn't help. It is important to offer not just vague ideas of what you think should be written, but present people who they can talk to, present ideas about what the story actually is. The fewer and fewer education reporters there are, the more they have to do. And so they need the help. They need guidance from local activists and people who are interested in about what is happening on the ground. There is no substitute for that kind of knowledge. And the only way they can get it is from people who care. People who care have to create local organizations that promote public education and don't allow the ones trying to rip down every let me start that over. They have to create local organizations that promote public education and don't allow the ones trying to rip it down win every argument simply by not showing up. That's still not enough. One of the things that has always perplexed me is why all of the various organizations that support public education, large and small, well-resourced, not well-resourced, can't get together and get some kind of a legitimate, effective branding campaign going on public education. In America, you can brand anything. Remember the pet rocks? Someone became a multimillionaire by branding a pet rock. So I don't know how it is that these organizations, and I have asked some of the union leaders, and it's not really a good answer, how they haven't asked somebody who's an expert in branding, like say, I don't know, Kris Jenner, put together a campaign that lays out the facts and that counters all of the myths, that uses language that speaks to people, not education jargon. Some superintendents are doing this work now. There's one guy in Colorado, one superintendent, who engages with his community in very different ways than many of his colleagues. He has an active public engagement campaign where he's constantly sending out reports and sending out different ideas to the community about what's positive about the schools, not always talking about the problems they are facing. The coronavirus pandemic made clear how fundamental public schools are to Americans' young people and how important in-person learning is. Human face-to-face connection. Yet we already seem to be veering away from those lessons, and the same old pernicious myths about public schools abound. The truth has to get out. No, public education isn't failing. It isn't a monolith. The unions don't run it. Some of our public schools offer the best education any schools offer anywhere in the world. Some are painfully awful. Some are bathing in resources, others are starving for them. Those disproportionately serving minorities at a time when our public school population is majority minority. A favorite canard of so-called reformers is that public schools are stuck in a factory model and haven't changed in 100 years or more. That's just completely false. Public schooling has changed significantly as a result of political, cultural, technological, and other kinds of change. But that's gospel in some places. The idea would be silly if it weren't so damaging, undermining trust in a public institution that depends on trust between teachers, parents, students, and administrators. I confess that the best pushback I have seen on the hypocrisy and myths is on the television comedy Abbott Elementary, which skewers the hypocrisy around education funding and policy. The show is funny, that's for sure, but what it's pointing out is actually a national scandal. One Abbott Elementary episode had the optimistic and chatty Janine making a snazzy video to beg people to contribute money or supplies because schools don't give them to teachers and teachers have to buy them on their own. It's an old story. It's baked into the system. She pasted pictures of 3 US presidents in an old social studies book to make it seem more current. Funny, but it is the reality in a lot of places. I once wrote a front page story in which a teacher in rural Bronson, Michigan told me, I am a scavenger. My friend who works in the Michigan Department of Natural Resources resources offices gives me their used binders, and my husband brings me furniture and supplies that the hospital he works at is throwing away. These kinds of stories still need to be told. The very basics. I called school board members and legislators around the country asking why this is still the case. No good answer. But there's also no focus on these kinds of things. There has to be focus on basics. Journalists need to be reminded, they need to be given the facts by the public so that they can write about them. The ultimate question is this: do Americans have the desire and will to reclaim the idea of a common good and push back against people who want to return us to a privatized education system that would be far more inequitable than the one we already have? I have to believe millions of people want public schools to survive and thrive. These schools were integral to the rise of this country, and they will be to its future. The work ahead does seem overwhelming, but it has to get done, and I think it can. Thank you for listening, and right now I am eager to hear what the panel says and engage with all of you.
Thank you so much, Valerie. That was amazing. I think we all learned so much already and have so many insights from your remarks. Among other things, I will say that, you know, when it comes to your comment about branding public education, it's clear that we are between a pet rock and a hard place. So I can almost feel the cringes coming through the screen right now. At this moment, I would like to ask our co-panelists, John and Ashley, to come back on screen, and I will first start with you, John Mooney, and ask for your responsive remarks based on Ms. Strauss's remarks.
Well, that is one tough act to follow. So thanks very much, Valerie. I want to give a little background on myself and how I got here, and then some thoughts on what Valerie said, and as you know, and maybe some advice on. I think I saw a question: how do you build relationships with journalists? And I might be able to help on that as well. But quickly, as I think it was, I won't go through my bio, but I am a product of print journalism. Started in the mid '80s. I guess I fall into the Watergate generation of journalists. And specifically all the President's Men, where we saw these heroes, you know, save the Union, and I said, I'll do that. It didn't take long for me to realize that Robert Redford didn't cover school boards, but I cut my teeth covering school boards, first with very small weekly newspapers outside of Boston, and then moving to New Jersey, where I worked for the bigger papers, the biggest papers in the state, namely the Bergen Record, and then the Star Ledger. And as Valerie mentioned, you know, the journalism or the education beat was somewhat of a starter beat in a lot of ways. Didn't have the heft, at least at a small paper like or smaller paper like the Bergen Record at that time. Didn't have the heft of the political beats and some of the others, but you know, that really started to change, and you know, in New Jersey there was some really heavy and heady stuff to cover, and it really, you know, generated a lot of front page news. I'm guessing a lot of folks on this call know New Jersey's history with school equity. But for a young journalist, I learned quickly, you know, the names like Marilyn Morehouser and Paul Trachtenberg and the Education Law Center in leading the Abbott versus Burke, and before that, the Robinson versus Cahill school equity cases that really, in a lot of ways, dictated school policy in this state, and still do in many regards. You know, in some ways, I see, you know, a sort of a half full situation. There's no doubt to me, having covered New Jersey education over that period of time, that Abbott versus Burke and the findings that came out of our state Supreme Court, you know, made a big difference in terms of bringing at least needed funding into the Abbott districts, 30, 31 districts, depends on when you count, largely urban, all of them poor. You know, really led to some fundamental changes in how New Jersey funded schools. and overcame a lot of resistance. There's some, I don't know, Bob, how many Abbott decisions there are. I think we're 20, if not certainly in the 20s, and may even have hit 30 by now. But decisions that really forced the state's hand, the legislature's hand, a variety of governors' hands, even shut down schools briefly, albeit in the summer, but certainly it led to some fundamental soul searching about how we're going to pay for this, and led to our first income tax. And I will say, I think that those have been really significant and huge strides, and not entirely solve the issues by any means. And I think the pandemic and remote learning really exposed some of the inequities that remain, adding some new issues, especially around technology, that weren't around so much at the beginning of Abbott when I started covering it, but really have at least given urban districts a shot. And where we now in New Jersey fund these districts at a greater scale than we do our wealthiest districts, at least on a state level. But it's and back to Valerie's theme of the key word of still. No doubt, the more things change, the more things also stay the same. One of the biggest issues when I started covering education in New Jersey was school vouchers, and largely beaten back down, not too long ago, but now resurfacing. As Valerie said, other states have picked up on it, and New Jersey, pretty blue state, didn't embrace it the first time, but you're starting to hear it more this time, including from Democrats, which largely were the wall against it back then. But now you're seeing some attention to it. Assessment is still an issue. There's a little less weight on it. We went through a period of time when assessments were going to be, or test scores were going to be, as much as 50% of a teacher's rating. That was beat back. But now you're starting to see some more attention to that again. Charter schools, certainly, big issue then, big issue now. Sex ed, huge issue in New Jersey in the 70s, one of the first states to incorporate it. Now we're going through a variation of it in terms of LGBTQ and how that's being dealt with in schools. And we're seeing the parent wars in New Jersey, without a doubt. Special education, New Jersey, again, a pioneer dating back, almost a century, actually, and still one of the guiltiest in terms of separate placements and some of the issues of private placements and some of the real concerns about that, where we have the highest ratio of private placements in the country. So the issues haven't gone away, and by any means, and even with my optimism around what Abbott brought, there are still some big holes, especially around school buildings. It was a key piece of the Abbott rulings, and New Jersey has, I'd say, largely dropped the ball, and wouldn't surprise me if we were going to be back in court over that one. Bob, you can let me know when you're ready to share that with the media. I'll go first. And certainly some of, there are plenty of issues. We are dealing with segregation. New Jersey, also one of the most segregated states when it comes to its schools and its housing, that is now in court and in mediation, but likely I'm sure that there's going to be all kinds of pushback. That is going to be another Abbott versus Burke, I think, in a lot of ways. How do you tell these stories? As much as schools have changed, so has journalism. I am also a product of the downsizing of local journalism. I worked at the Star-Ledger when they cut their newsroom in half and basically bought us all out. And there was a general feeling that it was a bigger risk to stay than to leave. And so I left and helped found NJ Spotlight, and we then became part of the PBS family. But not just the number of journalists on the ground, but I think the way of storytelling has changed. And I'd love to hear Valerie's thoughts on that. Valerie was always ahead of the curve in a lot of ways in really speaking speaking to the truth. I grew up in a time when it was much more straight news, or at least in my experience, straight news, straight stories. And there was Valerie out there, and she's right. She was alone in doing this and really speaking out, and some of her colleagues as well. And I think that is, you're seeing more voice in journalism, and you're seeing more points of view that I think is, it has its perils, but I also think it has its benefits, and it's helping people sort of sort through a lot of the noise. Now, some of it is also shorter, snappier, social, TikTok, which I know is causing some cringes out there. But I also think that it's bringing in bringing in younger, a younger audience, a more diverse audience into some of these really important public media or public issues discussions. In working with NJPBS, I also see the power of television. I know it's a dying breed in a lot of ways and being replaced by YouTube, but I also know that when a story makes it on TV, there's a certain gravitas that comes with it that I think, at least in New Jersey, and I know people like John Murrow have used the power of video and others to tell these stories. And I think that I see some hope in that. But it needs support. And, I don't want to end with a fundraising plea, but I'm going to anyway. I mean, for advocates, and let me quickly aside, ELC Ed Law Center has really carried the ball for advocacy in New Jersey, and sometimes quite a lonely task. The unions certainly have a prominence, and the NJEA in New Jersey is quite strong, but the ELC really always brought that moral strength to their case, and obviously convinced the courts as well. And advocates they're their own publishers now. They don't necessarily need journalists. I would argue that they need them more than maybe they know, but there's a lot of information that advocates can get across through their own websites, through their own listservs, every which way. I mean, we've certainly broken down the middleman, but also local journalism does matter. And to foundations and philanthropists out there who care about one issue or another, I make the argument that after that one issue or another, journalism should be your next issue that you care about, because the journalists are the ones that get those stories out there, whether it's on a national scale or on a local scale. So certainly, if there's an opportunities, and yes, we have a donate button on our website if anybody wants to see it. But it makes a huge difference to have the support, whether it's of large philanthropists or small donors. And I'll certainly make that case anytime. But I'm thrilled to be here. I thank you for inviting the journalists and to have this conversation. I'm certainly I will put into the Q&A my email address, and anybody who wants to reach out, especially about issues in New Jersey, I'd be happy to talk to you. But thanks very much.
Thank you, John. And that was really fascinating to hear about, your career and your evolution, and also your thoughts about how journalism has changed over the years. And also thanks for, we welcome the plug, both advocacy and journalism needs support. So, please, everyone support the New Jersey Spotlight. Please also, as a reminder, this is a fundraiser for ELC too. Any contributions that you can make would be much appreciated. We do engage in lots of the issues that John was talking about, whether it's Abbott, continuation of enforcement of Abbott in school facilities, voucher litigation and advocacy, including here in New Jersey, sadly, and some of the other major issues of the day, including school desegregation here in New Jersey and also in another state, Minnesota, right now, and the religious charter schools issue, which is currently pending in Oklahoma. We just survived a motion to dismiss today in the Oklahoma courts, so that's a piece of good news I can report. With that, I will turn it over to Ashley Burns for further comments and observations. Ms. Burns.
Thank you. So I am both a researcher at heart, but a strategist by day. And so I'm actually going to start with a little bit of some analysis on like how we got here through a media narratives perspective to inform the recommendations I have about how we effectively get the word out. No doubt all of us have seen many of the concerning and in some cases sensational headlines over the last couple of years. And the tactics have been, frankly, back to the abolition of slavery all the way up to now, but they have been about an us versus them, tapping into individualism and tribalism, and stoking fear to fuel mistrust. And often we see this a lot more currently, picking vague or unknown terms to confuse people and then present themselves as the solution. So I'm going to share a little bit about some analysis that I and my teams did and how that can inform what it looks like to break through. So a few years ago, in early 2021, I was doing an analysis about education funding, public education funding. You type that into the search engine and see what comes up. We have a tool that allows us to look at thousands and thousands of articles at a time. Interestingly, a really strange pattern started to surface, and that was what we now know is the manufactured crisis about, air quotes, CRT. We found roughly 2,500 articles mentioning CRT, and in the different clusters looking at them together, some topics were, what is CRT and what is this legislation? But if you zoom into the timeline and you zoom into the details, the coverage timeline really reflected this manufactured backlash. There was an incident in September 2020. There's a certain person who went on a certain news station, and a certain president at the time was listening. And then within a few days, this person was at the White House writing executive orders. And there was an election and then an insurrection. And shortly right after, in March of 2021, the coverage shot up exponentially. A topic that nobody really talked about except for experts and attorneys. The coverage shot up exponentially over the course of just a few months. Now, by June of 2021, the coverage was flooding the algorithms in search engines. But if you look closely at what the articles were, they were all from far right leaning outlet. Well, I dare I say outlets, but there are places on the internet that are publishing so-called articles. Places like the Epoch Times, Breitbart, other things like that. And so even something that someone could type in, what is CRT? It actually wasn't neutral. It wasn't factual. It was propaganda. And so when we looked at this analysis, before, frankly, most people had any inclination that to understand that there was an issue, the early sentiment of coverage really, really set the tone. Negativity spread across every subtopic, and from local and national policy battles, framing equity or inclusive curriculum as controversial, the water was poisoned well before most people were paying attention. However, while using the term CRT, because if you actually read the legislation, it was rarely about critical race theory. It was often about diversity or inclusive books or education. While using the frame CRT was neither factual nor neutral, it's really, really important in coming up with the best responses to move forward, to understand that creating fires and confusion was always a part of the strategy. So when you know that, you can more effectively not only assess a situation, but also respond in a way that breaks through. The good news is, even though after at least a year and a half of what Valerie was pointing out, that the mainstream media were not particularly helpful in this time, they were repeating the frames of folks who were not well researched or frankly had nefarious intent. Even though disinformation poisoned the narrative, it did not actually poison values. We have poll after poll, message test after message test across all races, regions, and political backgrounds. Effectively breaking through really does require tapping into shared values. When cynicism is at an all-time high and people, are on edge and they're maybe hearing some things that are making them nervous, there are ways to actually, help them regulate, help them be in it with you, and that requires tapping into shared values. So while the opposition had a huge head start, we have seen over the last few years that efforts to lift up the truth are actually making a positive impact. I was doing an analysis the other day, and I actually looked at the ARC, comparing headlines in 21 to 22 and 23. And in 21, everything was about, air quotes, either CRT. Even moving into 2022, it was about knockdown, dragouts at school boards, etc. While some of those things were happening, the vast majority of parents, caregivers, families, etc., actually wanted public education to support their kids to be successful, whatever it is they choose to go do. And so over the past few years, where advocates have been coming together and really getting strategic about what can we do at the school board, at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, that type of organizing has really made an impact, and people's commitment to driving narrative change is really working. And I'll fast forward to examples of when we saw the pendulum really shift in 2023. There was a poll that came out, published by Ipsos in the fall of 2023, and parents said, if you are a part of this extremist opposition, we will not vote for you. And a few weeks later, in November of 2023, many of those folks were voted out of office. People who were running on Moms for Liberty tickets or who were aligning themselves with political extremists, many of them lost. And I think about this wonderful example in Pennsylvania, where there was an article and the headline is, "We're still smiling. A Pennsylvania mom helps beat extremism in school board election." And so there has been this really incredible shift of this single parent who's maybe got 4 kids who are homeschooled, who was interviewed at the end of an exit poll, talking about why they don't believe in school, to actually more folks like you on this call whose voices are being elevated as more of the silent majority. We want our kids to have a place to go to school. We want them to be set up for success beyond high school. We want them to be in the classroom and be taught by and learn about cultures that are different than their own. So I name all that to say, while we have a lot of work and a steep hill to climb, there has been progress over the last few years. And it's so, so incredible to make sure that you are not contributing to the spiral of silence. Part of how the opposition and extremists win is they say something wild, or they say something nefarious, or they say something to stoke fear, and then nobody says anything. And I think there were great points made by Valerie and John earlier. Journalism does still matter and have the power, and they need to hear from people like you. They can't actually justify writing the story if it's just an idea in their mind. They have to hear from people like you who care about public education, who want the kids in their community and their communities to benefit from quality education and experiences that set our kids up for success and the future. So I will just wrap with a few little subtopics in terms of what are some things you can do or say to help break through, and some of the key strategies include things like centering families. If the extremists are creating an us versus them, then talk about families. What do we want? Don't play into the us versus them. Another thing is humanize, don't politicize. Now, that's not always the easiest thing to do, but when we can help folks come back to what really matters to you, what do you really want for your child? What do you really want for your community? I want my basic needs met. I want to be able to go to school and learn. And most of us, regardless of political ideology, actually do want that. And then I would say on a final front here, it's really, really important to remember, and you can check the data out there. There's lots of polls, there's lots of reports. While there is a loud but vocal group of extremists who are trying to suck up all the air in the room, they don't actually represent the values of the majority. There are many more of us who have these shared values, We want public education in our communities. We want the democracy that is afforded by having an educated electorate. And so I just urge everyone here to remember, lead with aspiration and follow with whatever your points might be. Engage with curiosity. Know that the well might have been poisoned, but the values are not. And with that, I'll hand it back to Bob.
Thank you, Ashley. That was really great. And, it's kind of uplifting in a way, even though we're in a moment here, but I think your specific tips and your uplifting message were really well taken. I just wanted to give an opportunity for all three panelists to respond to each other. Were there any further remarks or things you wanted to elaborate on hearing each other? I don't know, Valerie, if you want to start and pick up on any of the themes that John and Ashley happen to be mentioning, or either John and Ashley to respond further to what the others had said. So just have a little conversation here.
Well, I loved what they both said. I thought they were really smart and helpful. I think that the couple things that I think popped into my head when I was listening to both of them were one, yes, local journalism is really, really vital. And it has sustained such a big hit in the last 20 years that it's scary. What I think that people, what can you do about it? I think people have to be really, really active about letting the people who own media and the people who run it know that the public wants it. I think you have to call them. You have to get groups of people to call them. I think you have to let them know they want local news and they want education coverage that's deep and important. Just calling the education reporter, that's just the beginning. You're giving them story ideas, but individual reporters don't have the power to decide where things are placed, how many stories you can do on it, what side the staff is. You have to go to the powers, you have to go to the journalism powers, and you have to let them know. And now, unfortunately, there's been a lot of consolidation in journalism. So chains own a lot of things. Heck, go pick it in front of, go find ways to talk to the people who own them. Go find ways to the people who run the hedge funds that run them. Be ruthless about getting your message out. And listening to Ashley was delightful. The one thing I kept thinking was she's absolutely right. Most Americans are not extremists, but most Americans who can vote don't. And that's why, even though the vast majority of Americans, for example, believe in a woman's right to choose, this Supreme Court took down that law because people don't speak up. And so the country actually needs a new culture of speaking up and being aggressive about it, which is what Ashley was saying. That is absolutely vital.
John, Ashley, further thoughts from
Yeah,
you?
I wanted to add one piece on the local news front. Oftentimes they don't have a education reporter in this day and age. But one of the things I advise folks is get to know your local news. Read it and find out, whether it's going to be some, a single person, or it's, part of a chain or a weekly, or, but I think getting to know them, getting to know the reporters, getting to know what they write about, go to them, and, help them do their job. And if they write about something regarding schools that, piques your interest and you have something to add, get in touch. I think that oftentimes we're sort of behind this wall and nobody thinks that they can be approached, but I'd say just the opposite, and all the more critical. And I know some might say this is a cop-out, but opinion pieces, op-eds really do matter. I think, and they are a wonderful platform for not just reaching the audience of that news site or organization, but also putting it in a format where you can share it with your own constituencies. And it looks all fancy. It's got a headline and it's got a flag and all those things. And I think that those, opinion pieces, do world of good in terms of reaching audiences for us. But I also think it's a great way for for advocates and others to use them to reach their own audiences as well. So I always encourage op-eds and opinion pieces. I think some folks are afraid to do it, and there's some good templates on how to do it, because I don't want to mix opinion pieces with press releases, which sometimes does happen. But I think that they can be a really powerful tool as well.
Right. Ashley, any further reactions or thoughts, or we can also turn to questions and whatever you want.
Just one note on this last piece here about op-eds and others. I would also, to Valerie's point, maybe encourage folks to think about letters to the editor, letters to the editorial board. It may not get published. I think they get published few and far between, but hearing from you is really, really critical. And I think there's two things whenever you're talking to anyone that seem really, really critical in this time of both polarization and frankly confusion. It is important to name why it matters to you and your community. It is also incredibly important that you name the collective benefit, because everybody needs to be able to see themselves in the promise of public education. And because cynicism is at an all-time high, when we can name the collective benefit, they don't have to make it up in their head. So it's just really important that, whether you have school-age children or not, or whether you're proximate to education or not, it matters to businesses. We want to be able to hire people at some point, right? It matters to the local grocery store. Like they want, right? These things that make not only our communities, but our democracy go around are really important. So always be willing to think about, why does this matter for you? Why does this matter for me? And why does this matter for everybody else? So whoever you're talking to can see themselves and why they need to pay attention.
That is such an important point. The idea that businesses want to hire people who know what they're doing, who can think their way around a problem, who can articulate things without saying like and all the time. That's absolutely right. And so I think that when people are putting together coalitions to press something, business has a very large place in America. People listen, businesses have a lot of power. And a lot of, there are a lot of business people who support public education. Get them involved, particularly at the local level, get them involved in pushing for this kind of coverage.
This is great. Thank you all. I wanted to get to questions and answers, and I apologize in advance if we don't get to all of them, but I want to try to at least address some of them. But let me start out and take advantage of the fact that we have national and local experts, journalists and a communications expert here on the panel, and just zoom out a little bit. Let's talk about the news landscape this year, this insane year in the United States. We have a federal election in November. We have the Trump trials, one just finished and others perhaps to come. We have the Supreme Court issues both in and outside of the courtroom. We have the Israel-Hamas war, campus protests. We have so many things going on this year. And so the general question is, how are reporters and newsrooms nationally and locally prepping for this? And what would it be like? What will it be like, do you think, to cover news, to cover education under this sort of white hot glare of both national and international politics? And I guess also, John, for you, we have a lot of state politics going on too this year. So how do you think education will and can make its way into this whole complex news landscape and this year in particular?
More coffee, is that one answer? No, it is an incredibly busy time. And in terms of the news business, and with crises, large and small. And I do think, I have found, and as a reporter, that there is no lack of interest, even at the height of other issues. There's no lack of interest in our schools. And we in our pre call, one of the comments was, everybody out there is an expert in education. I've learned that, and for good or ill. In large, some folks are such experts in education that they can tell you, what should be the truth and the like. but everybody has an interest in it. Everyone went to school. Everyone has, you know, a sense of the things that worked for them. And I've always, you know, I've never found a lack of interest in covering these topics, and sometimes, you know, totally separate from some of the other topics. But people want to come back to their schools, and I'll again, you know, focus on the local news aspect, especially in local news. It's the one place that they have a touchstone with the powers that be of their local community. So I don't worry about a lack of interest or finding space. And one of the beauties of online is we have all the space in the world. The problem with it is we also have shorter attention spans than we've ever had. And so it's, you know, it's working through a balance of those things. But I don't worry about a lack of interest. It's you know, making it relevant to folks, and that's our job. And the good ones do it well, and you know, and I think should be applauded.
Thank you, Valerie. Ashley, any further comments about that? It's a kind of a insane year. And you know, and if not, like, I wanted to turn to one topic that that we've all kind of touched upon, which is the media's framing of the attacks on public education, and particularly the privatization and private school vouchers issue. Does the media, is the media tending to sort of minimize or not focus adequately or enough on the potential consequences of these attacks on privatization and the voucher movement? Can the media do a better job of sort of zooming out to show the growing threats to public education and democracy? You know, Valerie, you touched on this a lot in your remarks. And I imagine, you know, it may be more challenging to do that than focusing on a narrower frame involving specific people or more discrete issues or developments. You know, so, and you know, John, you mentioned the storytelling challenge. So how do we do this? How do we connect the dots and talk about big themes in journalism, big potential consequences of what's going on? How do we do that in this is complicated and short attention landscape?
You know, I think that on some level, people look at education as a local issue, okay? Because that's their local district, that's where they go to school. And I actually think that that's what newspapers have to their detriment have done, which is look at it's a local issue. And in more recent times, I have found that many people in mainstream journalism, like I mentioned in the opening, don't see the broad connections between the attacks on public education, the voucher movement, et cetera, with the attacks on other institutions. All of the public institutions have been subject to privatization. It's part of a whole movement where, as Reagan said, government's the problem, so let's get it out. And so at my own newspaper, when they created a democracy desk, I tried to get them to understand that having education coverage and writing about the movements, the funding, where the funding is going, what are the courts saying about it, that these are all stories that play into the idea of the decline of democracy. And you know what? Yeah, I got some lip service, but it has been very narrowly framed, the threat to democracy, as a voting issue. It's whether you can vote or not. And it is so much broader than that. Public school, you cannot have an American democracy without a public education system. You just can't have the kind of aspirational values that we have without the kind of system that we have, you know, that Horace Mann, you know, talked about. People from different backgrounds and places coming together, and as Ashley said, learning about each other. This is critical, but journalists don't see it. So I think, how do we do that? We have to keep pushing people. We have to keep pushing journalists to do that. I think that education schools, journalism schools have to do a better job of explaining why the education beat, in my view, is the best beat there is. It's because it's about everything. It's psychology, child development, budgeting, local politics, national, it's about everything. And so there needs to be a lot of work to get even journalists to understand what it is.
Yeah, thank you. And Ashley, you had mentioned a lot in your comments about this growing anti-CRT movement, developments, anti-DEI, anti-race, anti-sex, anti-LGBTQ policies that are sweeping the country. I remember doing a little study of how the anti-CRT states now that's passed legislation, and then comparing that to the voucher states and the low school funding states. And to my astonishment, the Venn diagram with all those three circles, it was like the middle part was really big because there's something going on here where there's a connection between these developments. And I just wonder, it's sort of this zooming out problem in journalism. How do we talk about this multifaceted attack on education and illuminate that and then present that to the public through stories?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things, and one of them is for people to just always have their spidey sense up when you start to see an us versus them or some nefarious thing that you need to be afraid of. Ask yourself, where is it coming from and who stands to gain from me being afraid of this thing? And so when I think about the importance of storytelling, whether it and again, this all comes back to democracy, vouchers, like all of the fears and trying to siphon money, taxpayer dollars from public schools and send it to unaccountable private institutions. That is, I've heard some people frame it as the $1 billion heist. It's really, really important that people understand there is a micro and a macro. There are micro local implications, like Valerie and John have pointed out. This is what is going to happen to our actual community if our neighborhood schools close. Turns out we only have one private school here, so that means the rest of y'all ain't going to school. Right. So, like, people need to understand what happens at the micro level, but at the macro level, what happens to all of us when billions of dollars that are set aside, so all kids in any community, regardless of their race, indigeneity, immigration status, can learn? What happens when that goes away? What happens, like in Arizona and other places, when the money that was supposed to go to pay for your homeroom teacher gets spent on stand-up paddle boards and flat screen TVs and trips to SeaWorld? Like, that's a problem. And so people need to understand, and this is important for people need to be able to talk about this to journalists so they can include it in their stories. There's a micro implication and there are lots of macro implications, and the story is incomplete if you're only telling one part or the other. It's really important to share both sides.
Great, thank you.
I should say both altitudes. There's not a both sides to this issue, both altitudes of the story.
Thank you. I want to also turn to some great questions here in our Q&A line. Maybe I'll start sort of with a couple of questions near the bottom here. First of all, are there specific major news outlets or media that you as panelists are following for your sources for more accurate information and updates on education issues? So we want to know where you go to for your news sources. And then I also want to just throw in there a question about about race. The media often treats Black and Latino supporters of education privatization as civil rights advocates while neglecting that the civil rights community is critical of privatization. How can journalists better account for ideological diversity within and across the communities of color? So it's a question about race, but also about how they're portraying people of color as being one way or another on a particular issue. So either of those questions, where do you go for news sources and how do we account for this media bias or slant around communities of color?
Well, we go to Valerie for news coverage. So there you go. I'm gonna pitch that one. Valerie is one of several giants out there. There do seem to be fewer of them. I'm curious her thoughts. I mean, when I'm looking, and this actually speaks a little bit to Ashley's altitude things as well, is I do spend a fair amount of time reading local news for education coverage, because I think a lot of these issues are percolating from the local. So now whether that's the highest quality always, obviously that's arguable, but I get a lot of intel from that, for sure. And then, there are some of the mainstream press that I do follow, and some magazines that I follow as well. But I think getting those details on a local level, and then being able to put them in context when you see the same stories playing out in other communities and across the country as well. It helps inform me a lot in terms of at least my past education coverage. I don't do as much as I used to for business reasons, but it's certainly it's something that I've done more and more as being an editor of education coverage as well.
Yeah, I read a lot of different, I look at a lot of different newspapers, big and small. Absolutely, you can learn a lot from local coverage. Some of the local papers do a really good job with certain stories, better than the national papers do. And I read reports from foundations and places that I trust to do nonpartisan stuff. So I will look and see what's coming out. A lot of education research is terrible. So you kind of have to know who's legitimate and who's not. You have to know what the biases are, what the methodology is. But so I get stuff from a lot of people, and then I just talk to people. When I see something, I'll call somebody in that area who I know, who I can trust to give me context that I don't see. So, and I do, the spotlight's great. I read, there are certain advocacy groups that do a lot of good work. And if going in what their bias is, you can read around that and see, you can get information from almost, you can get it from a lot of places.
I would just add to that, I have 2 kids under 4, so I have to have things come to me or they don't reach
No
me.
time for anything, yes.
So the way I get my information as quickly as possible is I actually sign up for a lot of newsletters. So I get newsletters from all of the large business magazines because I want to understand, how are you talking about or not talking about and thinking about education and the next generation that's coming up. I also sign up for Google Alerts, and just for me, what's been helpful is I just put in the topic and a couple of search terms that, like, okay, send me what's coming about equity, send me what's coming about public education or finance, or whatever the topic is, school boards, etc. And it just spits out all of the things in a certain time period, and I can quickly scan on my phone and read these 5 before I go into my next meeting. So for me, in that way, I actually get things from all over the place, from local journalism to national to, in some cases, international. And then the last thing that I would add on that note is there are some really, really great, as mentioned here, independent journalism that, like, you have to go seek out. And so you could type it into whatever search engine you use, but like best independent journalism, and just sign up for some newsletters. That's the only way I can find the time to skim and read, is that it comes directly to my inbox. So shout out to newsletters there.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I have the Google Alert too. I have a couple Google Alerts, and I get these big, huge strings of things. But it's interesting because you can sometimes see patterns of things that are happening all over. And unfortunately, too often, the pattern has to do with violence. I've thought about running something one day with just news alerts, just Google Alerts from an entire day, and then you see all kinds of stuff going on you have no idea about.
Any other thoughts about the question about representing the views of communities of color? We have this issue that you've talked about, where journalism is becoming more diffuse. It's also shrinking in both at all levels, but it's also becoming more diffuse, and there's more types of outlets, and there's other sources of information, social media, et cetera, podcasts, blogs, although maybe blogging has gone on the wane a little bit. But where do you see opportunities for communities of color to get their voices out and to be represented in the information news streams?
I'm happy to start the conversation here. So there's a couple of things. So it's interesting to me, Janelle's question about folks often being reflective of the civil rights organizations, because in my news feed, all of my alerts, I often see something different. And so one of the things that's true, though, regardless of what position we are seeing people surface as, is the journalists often either will talk to whoever they have a relationship with or whoever picks up their call or whoever they've heard about recently. And so I'm going to talk about one group for a moment and then I'll come back to your question. But like for the first year and a half of this, for me, as a person who worked alongside advocates and activists and other folks who were organizing, it was infuriating to see Moms for Liberty given this legitimized platform when they nowhere near reflected the vast majority of parents out there. But they became a household name, a commonplace, topic. And so I saw my observation and some of the media analysis, there was a volume of coverage where they were being legitimized. And we would say, hey, like, why don't you talk to these parents? And they didn't have the same credibility yet. So sometimes they were not lifted up in those stories. Now the tide has turned. We see a lot more parents from a lot of different backgrounds, but that's just one example. And the reason I name it is because some of us, I'll just say myself included, like I try to stay out of comments. I look, sometimes social media, it's just so divisive. I try to like give myself a safe space. And so some people opt not to engage. One way to actually make sure that the representation and being able to hold journalists accountable is by making sure, like, if you are a parent of a school-aged child or you're connected to those folks, a text message to everybody on the soccer team and everybody make this phone call or everybody send this email, like that's 10 to 15 people right there that they're going to hear from that actually starts to legitimize the fact that there are many other voices that should be listened to. And so it really does, when I talk about the spiral of silence, it really is important not only to lift up your own voice, but to encourage other people that their voice matters too. So you don't get this really distorted, one-sided, like this person represents all of us, because that's just not true. And if journalists aren't hearing from anyone else, like it would be irresponsible to be, making up fictitious people who represent a certain community. So just more of an encouragement to speak up in order to be able to hold folks accountable.
That's brilliant. That's exactly right. That is just brilliant. The Moms for Liberty thing drove me nuts, because that's exactly what happened. And it's easy for journalists to do that. And when they're in a rush and they're doing 9,000 things because there aren't enough of them, sometimes they do, it's easy. And it is true that many journalists have their list of sources and they don't expand them to include other, and because that takes effort and it takes time to build up the trust with somebody to talk to you. But of course, that is the central job of being a journalist, which is to tell all the stories, to understand the stories from all different kinds. So, yeah.
Actually, could you say a little bit more? I think you can explain this better than I can, but some people, especially given how, physical safety can be a risk here, there are different ways to engage with a journalist, whether it's off the record or on the record or on background. And I wonder if it would be helpful for folks to understand.
Sure. You can talk to a journalist, a reputable journalist on pretty much any basis you want most of the time. Sometimes, so on the record means they're going to use your name and they're going to say what you said. On background means that you can talk to them and they can use your material, but they won't say who you are. And you can negotiate the kind of attribution would use if it was me talking about the Washington Post. Could they call me a former veteran journalist, or just a former journalist, or a former poster? You can negotiate what you want. Off the record generally means you can't use it unless somebody else tells you that. Now that's a tricky one because some people say you can't use this, you can't go asking other people this. And so I have always had a hard time telling people I would listen to them off the record because I wanted the flexibility to be able to find it from somebody else. And so I would then say, can we do a variation of that? Can I ask other people if this is true without saying I know it's true, without saying where it came from? So you negotiate that way, but you can call a lot, most of the time people wanted to talk to me, it was always, are you going to quote me? And I said, I would never quote you unless you give me approval, but we have to do that now. Let's sort this out. And if you want to start, a lot of times people start off on background without attribution, and then they'll move toward it.
Yeah, I would reiterate that getting sort of those rules clear in the beginning is really important. So you're not caught in a situation where I thought you were on the record and you were off, or vice versa. And so, having some understanding, and I've gotten, as I've grown older, I've gotten, at least better at working with somebody in terms of, well, you can't quote me on that, but maybe you can quote me on this. I mean, there is, a certain negotiation that goes on sometimes when you're doing it. But I agree with Valerie. I go into most conversations, let's just talk on background, so we're not worried about, quotes and those kinds of things. And then, if there's something I feel that is useful to use or they want to get across, then, can I be on the record with that at least? Or, working that to a degree. But it is a bit of a dance sometimes.
It is. And oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just with, and I don't think this, your audience is going to run into this, is sometimes when I'm calling you to comment on something that is really critical, you're a key player in this, and I don't want to be off the record. And you come back and say, well, that was off the record afterwards. That's where we say, no, you're a key player in this story, and I'm confronting you, and you responded. It does take some dance, and I've lost a few sources along the way when that understanding wasn't necessarily clear. But I think it is important to make that very clear early on in a conversation.
I always am a little bit more lenient with people who are not public officials. Public officials, I give almost virtually no quarter to. When they call and say, oh, I'd like to take that back. Well, too bad. You're a public official. You do this for a living. When I talk to people who have a very difficult story to tell me, I always tell them at the beginning, I want you to think about this. I want you to think about what the consequences are for you. I want you to take a day, if it's not urgent, I want you to take a day before you decide whether you want to tell me this, and I can use it in any fashion. Very careful with people who are just because, it's better to give up a story than give up somebody's secret. So it depends, the public officials, and in Washington, that's a big deal because a lot of the times we're talking about public officials and they don't get a buy,
As a former minor public official in DC, I'm forewarned, Valerie, the next time I talk to you. I think grammatical integrity in my responses is the number one challenge, but beyond that, the substance. We got a lot of comments. I think you've already addressed this, but a lot of just practical tips here, how to cultivate relationships with journalists. You've dealt, any further comments about that? There were questions about how to bring in and support youth and even student journalism as well. So any comments about that? And then I guess we'll do a wrap-up question and close out.
Well, I talk to a lot of journalism classes. And if there are folks out there who know of journalism programs, either on the high school or college levels, who want to speak to working journalists, hopefully to encourage them. Hopefully they don't run away after I speak at their classes. But letting them see journalism in action, it can seem very remote at that age. It's also we're also lumped in together with a lot of the big mainstream and the CNNs and the Foxes and all, and journalism is comes in lots and lots of different forms and levels and skill levels for that matter. So breaking down some of those misconceptions about it, I think is really useful. And that happens, the professors and the teachers, making that effort and bringing some different perspectives together. So,
Yeah. I think every school should have a newspaper, a student newspaper. And my guess is that you could find a professional journalist on a local outlet to come and talk, be some kind of a mentor, maybe not every week, but you have a faculty member. But at every level, kids can be doing newspapers, teaching them how to think through things. I mean, it's doing and thinking, and it's to me, it's one of the great exercises. So if you're a parent, ask your school to do that, push them to do it.
And if you're connected to young people who want to get involved, Seek Common Ground organizes, I think it's like 40 or 50 youth organizers across the country, and they help them learn how to write op-eds. We've got 16-year-olds who have a lot to say, and they say it so well. They just need a little bit of sharpening from someone who's experienced. So I put their email address in the chat, but Seek Common Ground has the Student Action Network for Equity, and I highly recommend reaching out and getting your young people connected to them.
Terrific. So we'll close out here. I'll just ask you in a phrase or two, like one sentence. We have a lot of comments and questions about the fact that we're in a disinformation age, that we have people, even policymakers, who don't actually want an educated population. There's public erosion of public trust in our news sources, questions about journalism ethics and whether there's adequate fact checking going on. So amidst all of this, of these negative trends, what's one thing that you would say what's a reason for hope in this space? What can we do to sort of counter this growing perception about journalism? What's one thing to hang our hat on as we move forward and engage in journalism to improve education advocacy? Valerie, you want to close us out with a thought on that?
I think I'm a believer in there's always hope until there isn't. And we still have millions of people who want to be educated, who don't want social media to be destroying the fabric of the country, who are interested in ideas, who believe in journalism, good journalism. And I think the bottom line, and I think it's the only way this country is going to be saved, writ large, stand up. Stand up in all the ways you can find to stand up. Stand up to everybody and keep doing it.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not as so pessimistic. I think we are there's more information out there about schools and education than there's ever been, largely thanks to the internet and what it's allowed us to do, where I can read stories about schools in California or Cincinnati, where when I started this, I'd have to go to a store that sold newspapers from Cincinnati and LA. I think that there is a tremendous amount of information that we can build upon that's out there. And so in addition, I'm going to ditto Valerie on speaking up, but I also would say read up and view up and become educated on education. And not just in your own community, but elsewhere in other countries to boot. I mean, we didn't even talk about the global scene, but there's so much to learn from what's happening overseas as well.
All right, so we have speak up, we have read up. Ashley, you're a slogan, something that we can hang our hat on. Act up.
Kind of. Don't contribute to the spiral of silence.
Yeah.
I think every generation right now is feeling so much and they can use it. These things have been happening for decades, frankly, generations, but now we can't ignore it anymore. So use that. And if you haven't found a way, get together with a couple of other people, have some psychological safety and use that. So yes, Bob, I would say act up in that regard. Let your feelings drive you towards doing something and vote all the way down your ballot.
Wonderful, well said. Well, thank you. As we wrap up, I want to remind you one final time as Executive Director and Chief Fundraiser that this is a fundraiser. We'll put in the fundraising web link one last time in the chat. Please donate any amount that you can. It would be tremendous for us and for our future to have your support. And with that, I would like to wrap up and thank sincerely our panelists and speakers, Valerie Strauss, John Mooney, and Ashley Burns. I want to thank all of the webinar participants for coming today, and really think we had a lot to learn. We learned a lot in this session, and I think we're inspired to engage in all of our issues in the future. So thank you everyone for coming, and have a great rest of your day.